Our second speaker for today, as I had announced at the beginning, is Professor Samia HUQ, who is the Dean of the School of General Education and a Professor of Anthropology at Brac University in Bangladesh, also a member of our Scientific Advisory Board. And the presentation is called, Is it possible to carve a cohesive women's agenda between state, movements, and Muslim women's periods in Bangladesh? So thank you so much, Samia, for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Paulius. Thank you, everyone, for joining from near and far. Let me just share my screen. Right. So first of all, thank you to the Institute of Advanced Studies for hosting me for a month. It's wonderful to be here. I've just been here for 2 days, but I look forward to, the exciting, dynamic, intellectual sort of engagement that awaits me. I've come actually with a project that I've worked on for a bit, but a paper that I have not yet developed. And I wasn't sure if I would develop it for a variety of not necessarily conceptual questions, but for a variety of political questions. But the time seems good. I've been thinking about it, and I thought, why not work on some of the material that we have already to turn it into a full paper. So I've been working on, in collaboration with the World Faiths Development Dialogue at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I've had a 10-year partnership looking at the relationship between faith and development. So Bangladesh is well known for its grassroots development initiatives. Most of it is considered by and large very, very secular. However, the country is Muslim majority. It's had quite a shift in its secular status. And therefore, there's a lot of on-the-ground religious mobilization that happens. And it seems, and also development by faith-based organizations that happens. But it seems that that perspective is not really taken into consideration when policies and frameworks are drawn up for development nationally and internationally. By and large, it is not. And so this project that I ran with Georgetown was about bringing faith actors and secular development actors in conversation to see what kind of bridges can be built, if at all. It's politically charged, and it's got other tensions that come with it. So can development, the world of secular and faith-based development, speak to each other? And can there be a dialogue between secular/neutral, goal-oriented work and identity-based engagement with community? So how does that happen? We explored that question through some research, through some policy scoping, and through some real platform building where we brought groups of faith-inspired and secular actors together in conversation over a day, 2 days, sometimes a week in residential settings. This was considered interesting. It was considered, some considered it needed work in the context of Bangladesh, and some considered it quite risky. So the questions we asked was bringing cooperation around questions of education, gender, youth priorities, and media. So just to slip quickly into Bangladesh and the gender question, it leads South Asia in the Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum. Women's presence in parliament has grown. The country's gender parity scores are good in terms of health, and survival, educational attainment, and economic participation. However, there are challenges. So in the UNDP's Human Development Report, the Gender Inequality Index is 131 out of 170 countries. It's not very high. Women's presence in leadership positions inside key political parties and institutions remain very limited. Overall, women's labor participation remains low, and women continue to have lower nutritional and health status compared to men. Of course, there's also the legal framework and family laws that affect women disproportionately compared to men. So the women's movement has actually been quite instrumental in creating some of the changes that women, enjoy today. And of course, so has the state. Many policies have been pushed by the state, but the women's movement is something that started early part of the 20th century, started really by middle class to upper class women who were educated, and it came in the form of educational reform, bringing women out of segregation and putting them into education. In the 1960s, we see where Bangladesh was still Pakistan at the time, and the early 20th century, we were it was a British colony, it was undivided India. So by the time we get to the 1960s, we have some legal reform that really is seeking for the first time in an official manner to restructure family relationships. And then in the post-independence, 1971, Bangladesh became independent from Pakistan. And the post-1971 era, women's groups, feminist and women rights organizations, they've played a fairly good role in movement building, development activities, protests against religious fundamentalism and violence against women, state repression, and authoritarian rule. So the question is, why is this a secular agenda? Of course, we know recently from recent accounts of what secularism is and what it does and what it looks like, that it's not uniform. It takes a variety of forms and shapes in different parts of the world, and that its organic nature is highly contested and highly contextual. However, in the three phases, why this women's movement is considered to be secular is in the early part of the 20th century, when women were coming out and writing and wanting to go into education. They were not really shunning religion or Islam, but rather they were critiquing not the very liberatory side of religion, and therefore the more liberatory principles within Islam were invoked. In the Pakistan era, when we see the legal reform, actually that work was done in conjunction with the clergy. They were a group of clergy who were brought on board by the state or a group of clergy who were writing sort of a modernist, progressive interpretation of Islam and the Sharia. And it was that coterie of clerics that were engaged in support of the legal reform. Since the 1962 legal reform, there really hasn't been a lot of groundbreaking work as such. In fact, some of the things such as the permission for polygamy and so on and so forth were revoked later on. In the Bangladesh era, the women's work was considered secular because Bangladesh acquired a secular or wrote a secular constitution, which of course has gone through changes over the past 50 years. In the later part of the 1970s, we adopted Islam as a state religion, and therefore sort of problematizing its secular status somewhat. For about 10 years, the word secular was taken out of the Constitution. 15 years ago, it was put back in the Constitution. So as you can see, we've had some difficulty trying to figure out what our national ethos in terms of religion and politics and culture might look like. But what had happened in 1971 is, during independence, is that one of the leading Islamist groups, the Jamaat-e-Islami, did not support the war for Bangladesh. In fact, it had collaborated with the Pakistani state towards genocide. And so in independent Bangladesh, it was considered, we were not going to embrace that form of Islamism or from Islamism from that group. And therefore, any agenda moving forward was going to be couched under secularism as enshrined in the Constitution. Women's work has, of course, received a lot of backlash, especially in the past 20 to 30 years. There's some backlash which is internal, that women's work, which was, or women's movements, which were by and large led by educated women, did not take into consideration the intersectionality of gender, class, race, ethnicity, and religious belonging. There's also a generational divide that younger feminists, if you will, and older feminists don't tend to agree on the modalities of working, on the modalities of movement building, whether this should be voluntary work or paid work, whether it should be under NGO activity or not. So there is some contestation that's internal along a generational divide. And of course, the external backlash has come from conservative forces, Islamists, political groups challenging gender equality, suggesting complementarity of gender roles and not equality. And also some still continuing to advocate segregation. The other external backlash is under the protection, under the guidance, aegis of Islamist groups or conservative groups. Maybe they're not political as such, but they're transnational religious groups. Maybe some are pietistic movements. There are women's religious groups now. So women's groups are no longer just secular. There are women's religious groups who speak in the language of rights and entitlements, yet they disavow secularism. So that sort of throws the whole question of, what might be a women's agenda that women across the board, taking into consideration intersectionality, can work on together. So in terms of the development, if we couch women's progress under development, women have come into development through a variety of state-supported international development initiatives, and that's come with varied outcomes for women's autonomy. Some are, as I listed right at the beginning, there are challenges to women's development and gender development. Women are by and large do feel benefited, whether they've been able to acquire the kind of autonomy, independence, being able to speak for themselves, being able to articulate their own voice remains a question. It's contested. And then, of course, Islam has been included in development goals. So one is secular development actors are engaging women through microfinance, through microcredit, through political awareness campaigns, so on and so forth. And the other is Islam is intentionally, deliberately being mainstreamed into development projects towards mostly gender outcomes. So such as family planning. The clergy were enlisted to speak to women about, and to men and women about, the importance of reducing birth rates. We had a problem in the early part of the 1970s, and this is actually a successful program that took off. And then, of course, engaging the clergy again in terms of trying to shape violence against women and try to reduce violence against women. These are two big projects that stand out. There's been critique of these things as well. That do you engage men to talk to families about women's bodies and what happens to the question of women's voices, and them being able to speak for their voices and what they would like to do with their bodies. So women's authority and leadership remains an issue that is yet to be resolved. So Muslim women's voices, what do we mean by that in the context of Bangladesh? It's not linear, of course, it's not homogeneous. There's a traditional perspective. This is women who are educated in madrasas. That's the Islamic stream of education. They attend madrasas. They tend to be from conservative family backgrounds who have attended madrasas. And we've done research as a part of this project on various madrasa graduates, women teachers and students. And it shows that, their relationship with conservatism is not one that isn't without questioning, is not one that is not without wanting to acquire a public voice, although they're very, very shy and resistant of feminism, and they don't want to be secular. So they want to dress in a certain way, look in a certain way. They want to, hold on to a certain kind of education that trains them in Islamic thinking. However, they want to speak in the public space, and they want to be able to speak on their own. And there's a lot of silence around pushing family boundaries while fitting into society. So that there's a tentative space that they navigate. Islamist groups are very interesting. They, from really in the 1940s and 50s, highlighting by and large that women must that women's ultimate role is that of a mother. They've moved away, of course, far from that. And in present-day Bangladesh, we see that actually, in order for Islamist groups to come into democratic politics, they've had to acquire the female vote bank as well, because women having the right to vote was an Islamist commitment right from the beginning, from maybe 100 years ago. So if women have the right to vote, who would they vote for? We see that in Bangladesh over the past 30 to 40 years, the NGO world of secular development has really brought women into income generating activities through microfinance, so women have become aware of their right to livelihood, the control over it, and a variety of forms of social protection. So with this engagement or this enmeshment women have now with secular development has prompted Islamist forces to kind of recognize that women are also individuals. And in addition to being mothers and, with their very divine role to protect the family, that they actually can and should have a place in the public space, albeit within certain restrictions. And then, of course, modern Muslim women. Who are these women? These are not women that are, sort of the secular feminist world, but the everyday woman who does very much identify herself as a Muslim woman and is suspicious of secularism. However, she attends, for example, I mean, we did some FGDs with our students even, she would come to a university where I teach, they're out working in banks, they're engineers, they're lawyers. What do they want? It looks like they sort of acquire some kind of an Islamic feminism, if you will, they want to take own their Muslim identity, to Islamize the public space, to religionize it, but religionize it in a way that it will work for them. So they want to, for example, acquire the space of the mosque as a feminine space. It was by and large a male space. And push back against barriers that say that women cannot be in these religious and public spaces, and acquire that to, address their needs as Muslim women. What those needs are, of course, is an ongoing conversation. Right now in Bangladesh, we're in the middle of a very volatile debate between religion/Islam and LGBTQ matters. Perhaps this is something that is unfolding in a variety of Muslim contexts. So given that that's the position, there's secular suspicion, of course, and there's also negotiation. There's been an Islamization policy since the late 1970s. Of course, the proliferation of transnational Islamic groups, which I already mentioned, enduring and sometimes disruptive Islamist politics, a Muslim majoritarian ethos, and equality before the law failing to hold, and of course, ideological differences. These things still make the secular women very, very wary of engaging, this new landscape, this new citizenry, young citizenry. What does that mean? And how do you take that into consideration if you want to formulate a cohesive women's agenda? So, there's mutual misunderstanding. And there's real tentativeness to work together or even be in conversation. It seems that when women don't come together and cooperate, these questions really remain in the hands of a male clergy, let's say, the clerical order, or the state, which absorbs the male perspective by and large, or the secular women's perspective. So in a way, it's a disservice, I would argue, and this is where I've been tentative to argue it like that, because a lot of my secular colleagues, feminist colleagues, think that I've lost my head and I'm inviting trouble. And a lot of my Muslim women friends don't think I'm Muslim enough. So, it's kind of it's a tricky space to say that they should be in conversation. And I want to pick up on through the variety of research, a lot of it ethnographic, a lot of it narrative accounts. I'd like to pick up on the intersectionality of silences, compromises, and trade-offs across the secular religious divide amongst women, to ask and see what emerges by way of perspectives and understanding and directions for a new gender equality agenda. So that's kind of the very ambitious thing that I want to, gather my thoughts on while I'm here. Of course, our research has also yielded that at the policy and practical level, engagement of clergy in development, not as mere strategy, but also programmatically, that would be very, very important. There's also building leadership and literacy across the religious secular spectrum, also as interfaith undertakings. This is also something that has emerged in our interviews. It's not something that's in mainstream thinking when you think about religious education for a secular world. So I'd like to actually unpack some of what we've found and put that into writing over the next month. And of course, political will for genuine secular and religious leadership for women. Again, that's not a conversation that policymakers are having as yet. There's very little work in progress on this on the ground. There's some good examples in Asia, notably out of Indonesia and in Africa out of Morocco. But as a large Muslim majority country that is also very invested in secular development and secular women's leadership, this is not something that has been considered by the state very fully. So that's also something that we found in our project, and something that we've actually done some research on, that we think might be an ingredient to carving a more cohesive women's agenda across the religious secular divide. So these are sort of roughly the ideas, the contours of the paper that I wish to complete. I'm not sure where do I start with faith and development, or do I start with women for the paper, but I'm thinking about it. And yeah, that's all for now from me, and I'd love to hear comments from you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Samia. Are there any questions from the audience? Thank you, Samia, for your presentation. We can see a growing contradiction between the weight of religion and the status of women in several Muslim countries, such as Afghanistan and Iran in particular. Could you tell us what has been the impact of the repression of women in both countries on Muslim women's activism in Bangladesh?
Right. Okay, that's a loaded question. I haven't, Muslim women's activism. So definitely, this is not something that I've studied sort of systematically to look at groups and organizations that are linked either to Iran or to Afghanistan, but we have had some religious outfits that have been very inspired by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they've been they were banned. I don't know if you know, we've just had a revolution in Bangladesh. So there's been the sort of a 16-year-old regime was ousted. And that regime, very interestingly, called itself a secular, the guardian of secularism for Bangladesh. But interestingly, what it did was, and the critique was that it bought into the global war on terror to militarize the political landscape, and to first militarize and then put away in prisons sort of Islamic groups. So in a way, it was just a repressive regime, and it sold its secular status based on these kinds of activities. So groups that aligned themselves with Taliban, by and large, were not very free to roam around. Very interesting, in the last 2 months, everybody's come out of jail. So we are in a very sort of almost like a post-Tahrir Square moment where, everybody's come out to play, including those that were locked up because they had, they harbored militant tendencies in the name of religion. So because they were locked up, we knew that they had some women's groups as well. But those were not the mainstream ones. The mainstream ones in Bangladesh are much more the Jamaat-e Islami, Hizb ut-Tahrir, some groups that were born in the UK, transnational, urban, educated. They would invoke, women do often invoke good things about the Islamic revolution in Iran for women. Or not so much the Taliban, I haven't heard it, but Iran as a place where women were, of course, came under certain kinds of clerical repression and rule, but also a place where women then were able to be more active to bring about some changes for themselves later on, and that it doesn't all have to be all damnation. So you see some kind of utopia being invoked once in a while. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but there are some effects, not something that I can systematically trace. And also the whole history of a repressive secular regime that is now. So now we are actually in a bit of a pickle, because secularism is not such a good word right now, because it's seen to have aligned with the global war on terror.
Great. And I have another one in the chat from Gordon. Thank you, Samia. Can you tell us more about how faith-based organizations navigate the tension between the desire to promote a particular faith and the demands of an international development agenda? Which of the two is the priority? How complementary are the two agendas?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the faith-based organizations, they're not all the same. There are some faith-based organizations that are just faith-based in principle, such as Caritas, let's say, or World Vision. These are sort of, or even Islamic Relief. And they operate, they have big offices in Bangladesh, and they operate, and their work really is very much, service delivery, looking at environmental issues right now in Bangladesh. And they look and act like secular faith-based organizations. And they do promote the international development agenda. And for them, it's very interesting if you meet with them, the reflection about what it means for them as personally, as faith inspired, that stays very much at the level of philosophy, and it doesn't really trickle down to work. There are other faith-based organizations, especially in Bangladesh, that are sort of mosque-based or madrasa-based or a temple-based. It's very interesting. They want to do more mainstream development work. They want to be in collaboration with the international world of development. They want funding, of course, to do more of their work. They're not as well versed in the language of development. So that's why the work that we did in, speaking to them about, what is the language of development in gender, or let's say, what are some of the development priorities in education, where they as education providers can probably think about doing more. There's actually a lot of work to be done to bring them up to speed. So the issue is that they have a community appeal and a big community presence, and they're often considered leaders of the community, but they have not acquired the development language. So therefore, that's the disconnect. Which of the two get priority? They have their own place. Of course, there's a big international development agenda. We have a big local development civil society platform in Bangladesh as well, that work with international development organizations through funding, through cooperation, collaboration. Some of these NGOs are massive. You may have heard of Grameen Bank, or Brac is a sister organization of my university. They're massive, and Brac is also international. It exists in Latin America and in Africa and other parts of Asia. So that's very big. That really does take priority. But we feel that the faith-inspired development organizations also need to sort of get up to speed, but they need to get up to speed in a way that they are comfortable, in a way that they don't lose their faith component. So that's sort of the conundrum. And that's the space for dialogue that we wish to promote.
Wonderful. And then there's Pavel. Thanks, Samia. Could you please give some additional details on the religious composition of Bangladesh? Are there non-Muslim populations, and how much is that? Are all Muslims Sunni, or there are other groups?
Right. So Bangladesh is 93% Muslim. No, 91% Muslim. It was 8% Hindu, and then 1% Christian and Buddhist. So has a long, the Hindu and the Muslim population is the one that, predates, prehistoric subcontinental sort of history and identity. The Muslim identity becoming very prominent in the 12th to 13th century, and then of course the whole Mughal era. Currently in Bangladesh, the way it divided from Pakistan, we came in with, I think, about 14% or 15% Hindu, which is now dwindled to 7-8%. I don't think we've been particularly great to the Hindu minority population, and I would argue that a social and political Islamization has not really helped. It's very easy to cross the border and go to India. Many Hindus have found a safe refuge there. With a Hindu majoritarian BJP in power in India, the Hindu-Muslim relationship is a little bit more complex across the border. It's mostly Sunni. We have about 2% Shia, and we have a even smaller percentage of Ahmadiyas. Ahmadiyas have been declared non-Muslim in Pakistan. There is a call to declare them non-Muslim in Bangladesh. It has not gained grounds, but depending on who's in power, we see that off and on, but they are still not declared non-Muslim. The Shia live very much as a minority. The Shia also have a complicated relationship with nation building because they're Urdu speaking by and large. And that ethno-linguistic nationalism was one of the foundations of Bangladesh becoming Bangladesh and moving away from Pakistan. So the Shia have had a problematic relationship in terms of fitting in to a Bengali-speaking Bengali country, but there isn't a lot of aggression against them as Shias. There has been some aggression against them as ethno-linguistic categories, but not necessarily as a Muslim sectarian category. I hope that answers your question, Pavel.
Great. And then Abdul asks, thank you very much, Samia. My question is how strong the religious parties are as far as parliamentary representation is concerned.
Great. So it's not particularly strong. It went in 1990 from in a house of 300 seats. It had 18 in 1990. So this is mostly the Jamaat-e-Islami, along with some other Islamic coalition members. And then in 1996, it dropped down to 6. And then I think it went up to 8 again. So it's been in that region. Since 2008, we have not had elections. We had one in 2008, and then the 2014 and 2013 and 18, they were rigged elections. They were completely rigged. They stole the vote. So we don't have a fair representation. Right now, after the revolution, as I said, everybody is out to play. Everybody's out to play. The Jamaat-e-Islami is really looking at coming back in a big way. They were very, very badly repressed in extrajudicial ways. So there's a lot of sympathy for them now. They've also done a lot of social mobilization around kind of social Islamization. So people feel that there is sympathy for them. The liberal forces are really out now to say we have to have strong coalitions, because like I said, the last regime, which is the Awami League, it's the oldest political party in Bangladesh. It's something that seceded from the Muslim League, if anybody's familiar with the history of South Asia, in the 1950s. It won the democratic election in 1970 for all of Pakistan under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and then there was a call to move away from Pakistan. So the Awami League is in the doghouse now, because the last 16 years they were very repressive. So now the question is, who is our liberal force? Because the Awami League is right now being termed a fascist force. And so the liberals are very worried about getting a liberal coalition together. The liberal forces, very interestingly, were NGOized in the last 50 years. They're civil society platforms. They were not really political platforms. So there's some trepidation now that the Jamaat-e-Islami will now, when the polls open, hopefully end of 2025, they may emerge as a major opposition. And who knows, they may be in power in 5 years. So yeah, that's the trajectory we're on. We don't know. It all depends on how things unfold politically in the coming years.
Great. Thank you so much. That's, yes, all the time we have today. But again, Samia will be here the whole month. You can speak to her at the Institute. To finish, so thank you so much, Samia, for joining us today. And